bit. Some of you know Forrest Edwards, some of you have already talked about Forrest Edwards here in the past. But first, a couple things. There is a printer and a keyboard over there that we are giving away for free because we don't use them anymore. If somebody would like to have a printer or a keyboard, feel free to take it. And also, we're always looking for volunteers or prospective board members for the Historical Society. If you are interested, find me or Maureen or Jean or Callie, and I saw Alan somewhere in the back, and just let us know. All right, so we'll talk about Forrest Edwards. I was really interested in Forrest Edwards personally when I came to town because I bought property on Forrest Edwards Road, and I thought, wow, who's this person that's named after? And I heard a whole lot of different stories, and most of them, I think, rightly depicted him as a miser, and then some of them sort of depicted him as a curmudgeon. And while I didn't know Forrest myself, based on what I've seen, I wouldn't say that that's accurate necessarily. I think he was actually a very nice person. He just was willing to pinch a penny when it happened. So the first, we'll go back a couple generations before Forrest. The first Edwards to move to town was Nathaniel Edwards, who appeared on the 1790 census here in Otisfield as head of household. His brother, Jonathan, would arrive in the spring of 1797. And Jonathan had his own son named Nathaniel after his uncle, who was born in 1789, just before Jonathan moved to town. As an adult, Nathaniel lived with his family for a couple of years, but they had some sort of family strife. And he lived with the Hancock family, and then what would you like? Okay.
Go down the side.
No, down the side.
Nathaniel would serve in the War of 1812, and he ended up buying 60 acres from James Stone for $8, which he got by trading one of his cows. And he loaded up all his goods into a box cart and went to the property that he purchased. I am not sure if that's the same property that the Edwards homestead is on or not, but it would have been close. He had a son named Dominicus, and Dominicus was born in 1832. He raised hops for a while. He planted the hops crop and he sold them around, I have a record here that he sold his entire 1870 crop of hops for $2,200, which would be about $37,000 today. He ended up stopping the sale of hops because of health issues, according to the family history of the Edwards family. In 1878, and he planted the first 200 apple trees that were found on the property. But I think that he was best known for being wounded in the Battle of Dunkertown, which I'm gonna relate because I can't recall it immediately, but it's in Spurs history here. It's a little anecdote. When Simeon Edwards, the son of Isaiah, was married, the people came to serenade him, as was customary then. But he refused to come out, and his father stood on the woodpile and ordered the serenaders to stand back. When they advanced, he threw stonewood at them, so vigorously with such good aim that they were forced to retreat. Dominicus Edwards, who carried 5 cowbells, was wounded in the shin by one of Isaiah's missiles, which was well aimed. Not discouraged, the serenaders came back again the next night, but met with the same reception, and the same the third night, which finished the battle. Tradition says that Isaiah was wounded in the battles, and they sent for John Piper, who had something of a reputation for being a doctor. Dr. Piper said there was only one thing that could be done to save the life of Isaiah, and he proceeded to take out the bowels of Isaiah and put in the bowels of a sheep in their place. It was said that Isaiah survived the operation and the next spring had a pair of twin lambs and ever after hankered for browns. But doubtless this was a slight exaggeration. So Dominicus, after this battle, many years, he ended up stopping in the hops business. There was some speculation that maybe it was due to, that the hops were raised for beer, but this was a really prohibitionist time in the state of Maine. Hops were also used for making bread. I suppose that he probably sold them to bread bakers and not beer makers. We were right in between, the Portland rum riots and the Maine Constitution banning alcohol. So I have to imagine that being openly selling your $2,200 worth of hops for beer consumption probably wasn't great. Anyway, Dominicus had 3 sons, Llewellyn, Forrest, and Dayton. And I'm going to suppose that Dominicus actually, even though he was a farmer, respected education to some degree, more than others may have at the time. Dayton went to Hebrew Academy, which cost, I think at that time, about $12 for 12 weeks, something like that, which is a good amount of money. We sent them all the way to Hebrew and paying for it. Both Llewellyn and Dayton ended up going to Maine. Llewellyn became a respected structural engineer who helped build bridges. He fought in wars. He's buried in Arlington Cemetery today. Dayton became a professor at Columbia University and compiled the Edwards family history at some point. So from where I'm going to pull some of this information. Forrest, I don't have any evidence that he went beyond the 8th grade, but he clearly learned a thing or two about money and hard work. Forrest took over his father's orchard, I think, in about 1905. That's when he wrote out a mortgage to his family. He put, I think, $5,000 to his parents that he would take care of them into perpetuity until they died. And that's when he took over the farm and started planting more and more and more apple trees. Eventually, I don't know the total number of apple trees. By the 1930s, I think there were 2,000. By the time he died in the 50s, by the time Spur's history was written, there were 3,000. Shortly after he died and Milton took over, it's listed that he had 6,000 trees in the orchard. He did very well with those trees for a couple reasons. One was that he had planted a whole bunch of Red Delicious, and then Red Delicious became the apple that people wanted to eat. He shipped them all around. Forrest was known for getting up early in the morning and loading up his big ox cart, hauling off with his oxen to Mechanic Falls to load his apples onto the trains. And if he got back in time, he would preload his apples onto the cart to get ready for the next morning. It said that he was very strong. One anecdote that I read was that someone working for him went to pick up a barrel of apples and he fell over backwards because it was so heavy. And Forrest caught it and straightened him and grabbed his own barrel and helped him take the barrels out. He was also, I'm going to say, Forrest was really generous sort of to the town, I think, based on what I've been able to find. During the Great Depression in the 1930s, Forrest had money. There are a whole number of mortgages in this town where people borrowed money essentially from Forrest and put their property up in order to, it's collateral. I don't see any point where he ever foreclosed on someone. In fact, I've seen just write off the entire loan at times, depending on who they were. There's the only record that exists for any the only time that I've seen any mention of Forrest outside of the Otisfield area. He was actually brought up in a divorce property battle in Falmouth because a couple had, a lady that was working for him, her husband had borrowed money during this depression. Forrest had given them, written out their mortgage and let them have it. And the husband became an incorrigible drunk. And the husband accused them in the divorce and made it into the papers that Forrest Edwards up there in Otisfield was going to give her $30,000 if she continued to work for him, which the wife denied, saying both that she'd never heard of such a thing and that she would never have survived working for Forrest any longer. Makes me think that he probably worked his coat pretty hard. Suffice to say, he never loaned money to that husband again after being in the papers. Forrest never married. He was engaged twice. Both times he bribed his fiancées to call it quits, and told his family that getting married would just be too expensive. In talking about sort of his miserliness, the anecdotes, he at one point appeared at the bank in Norway. He wanted to take out $5,000. He asked the teller to give him, to let him have $5,000. The teller said, I must have misheard you, you want $5? Because Forrest had showed up in his torn jeans and rope belt. And he said, no, I want $5,000. He was going to buy a car. And the teller went to the back and got the manager. The manager came out. The manager recognized Forrest. And was like, oh, Mr. Edwards, let us get you your money. Forrest kept his money in the bank. Everybody knew that he had money, but he was really clever with it. He kept it in the bank rather than buried in his yard. At one point, some folks broke in and stole his safe, thinking that's where he kept all his money. They found, I think, 2 property deeds and a picture of his mother. He would loan money to the town needed it, and then have them write off his taxes. But he did pinch every penny. I found here in 1943, he petitioned the state of Maine for $246.67 because pheasants had eaten his apples. And pheasants were owned by the state of Maine and protected by the state of Maine. And he was given $246.67 by the legislature to repay him his lost apples. He, trying to remember all the stories here. When he died,
Sorry.
when he died, he left his homestead to his brother who didn't want it. And he left everything else split between his brother, his late brother, so his brother Dayton, his late brother, and his 2 daughters, and they received 2/3 of his estate. His cousin, Milton Allen, who ended up taking over the orchard, received 1/3 of the estate, and it was valued, I think, just over $250,000 in 1954, which is about $3.5 million today. But it would have been a lot more, 1,500 acres, and all on the coast. He made money at every way you could think of. Here's an ad he placed offering rentals out on his cabin out on Lake Thompson, so that people could have it. And he was just, he loved it. I'll never see the amount of money that Forrest had just from working hard. But he probably worked a lot harder than I do. I'm trying to think. But as part of that, it wasn't just about the money. Like he gave it out freely. He did acts around town. His brother was a respected engineer, structural engineer, but they probably learned something about stonemasonry work when he was Lyle are growing up, because Forrest is responsible for building the wall out in front of the South Otisfield Cemetery, and the stone building that he built down on Forrest Edwards Road is still there today. It's a garage in a way. He played music for the folks at the Grange over in Casco. He was a Freemason at the lodge over just across the border in Harrison. And I can't find, I don't know, this was surprising to me, as I said, because I came in it, and the reputation of folks was that he was very curmudgeonly. And I don't think so. I think he was just miserly. And they're not the same thing, right? I don't think he disliked people. He seemed to be really generous to everybody except himself, where he still drove his oxen across Lake Thompson. At one point, he was lost in a snowstorm, and he settled down overnight in between his two oxen. Just, slept it off. Found out he was miles off course. But I don't know. I've lost my place in my brain, in my mind here. And I'm going to open it up a little bit. I came in. Richard Burke, you did this before. You live on the old homestead, right?
Yeah. We live on the hill across from the house site that used to be Forrest Edwards.
Yeah.
Beth and I bought the property from Silwagwa. We bought 90 acres from them in the early 80s, and we ran it as a picture home for the apples. A lot of the stories we collected were from people who had worked for Forrest or knew him, and so we picked up a lot of information from those people, because it was kind of interesting to hear. The part I never got figured out, and I don't know if you did, was he seemed to have political pull. For this person who shunned romance and affiliation with a lot of other people, apparently served on the board of directors of Central Maine Power.
Yeah.
And he owned a fair amount of it. But when he built the Forrest Edwards Road, well, I guess the road was there, but he paid to pave it, because he had a barrel mill down by the pond.
Yeah.
And he got the state to pay for that, in part. And for a while, it was a state road.
Yeah.
In fact, at some point, the town got involved, probably after he died, and said, we're not going to do this. But he had some kind of pull with the state for a couple of different reasons, and that's one.
Yeah, I mean, he got the legislature to give him $250 because pheasant saves apples. If I had to guess, it's because he had so much money. Would be most of the political pull. I remember the only stories that I saw, or the only anecdotes I found where there was any sort of animosity in his history, actually, I think it had to do with Forrest Edwards Road. Maybe it was one of the other roads right there, where he built the road because his cousins wouldn't give him access to their land. Like there was a family feud going on. And so he built a road around their property because they wouldn't let him cross anymore. But I don't, if I had to guess, his political pull probably just came from the fact that he was really well to do for the time.
He was.
He's still really well to do by today's standards. He's not a tech millionaire, but he's did pretty well. And sir, you missed your name, but you worked for Forrest Edwards.
I worked for Forrest Edwards back in the 50s. When I was going to high school, he used to come get me and go and help him. We did everything.
Was it hard work? Or was it a hard job?
Well, he expected you to work hard all the time. No slacking. But no, I graduated in '54, and that was the year he died. But I had worked, a lot in the summer and winter time, everything, trimming trees. He wouldn't pick an apple off a tree. Nowadays they do that. He'd crop them up so they wouldn't break the limbs off. Yeah. But nowadays they pick the apples, excess apples so it don't break the tree down.
Yeah.
But he used to crop them up, so we cropped up a lot of apple trees, and I picked a lot of apples and worked in the cold storage. in the evening after they get done picking, we had to put all them apples in the cold storage.
Yep.
And sometimes I wouldn't get out of there till 9, 10 o'clock at night. Got out 6 o'clock in the morning.
But, so I would only ever find anecdotes from former employees in the newspapers. Did people work for him for very long? I was curious about that. Did people work for him for years, or did they do?
Well, you did. They come back, pick apples year after year. A lot of people did.
Did he pay his employees well?
Well, I don't remember now how much he paid us, but I don't think it was more than 50 cents an hour.
Well,
But he come over to the Oxford to pick me up, and someone going back to the time, he'd be doing about 20 miles an hour or something like that, you know. Then one morning, we were doing about 50 miles an hour. That was fast, but, you know, and we went off the road 3 times. And we went around that corner to go down his road, to the chain bank there, we were running right into it. And the time I got down there, I couldn't pick apples, I was shaking, so.
Derek, you mentioned Red Delicious. Is that the only apples that?
no, they grew Macintosh, Red Delicious, Golden Delicious, and there was a cider apple that I can't remember the name of right now that actually ended up being very important. There is a orchard, the state runs an orchard in Monmouth, where they do the apple trees, and a lot of that rootstock comes from Forrest Edwards.
Oh, wow.
Because there's a cider apple that doesn't taste good. Let me see if I have the notes here.
Oh, while you're looking there again, it comes back to his political ties. He
Yeah.
convinced the state that they needed to develop an experimental farm. And it became Highmore, which is the place in Vermont. And he helped stock it, and he got the political support to get the financial funding it needed to go.
And another thing we used to do is, after they get done picking, we had to go through all the orchards and pick up all the apples that was on the ground. And they took them out for cider. Now, any apple hit the ground, they don't let you make the cider out of it.
Yeah. 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 The Red Delicious and the Golden Delicious really picked up not only in the U.S. but also internationally. And so he would take his apples out to the trains, and then they'd go out to port and he'd ship them. Milton Allen ended up what became Allen's Orchard. There's a whole article here about the Dutch just going crazy for the apples from Allen's Orchard, taking them out. I don't know how Forrest Edwards got the political power outside of just being wealthy, because there's no record. I thought for sure that I was looking to find property records outside of Oxford County in Maine, or outside of Cumberland County at the time. No, he owned land in Casco and he owned land in Otisfield. He didn't leave except apparently to take his apples out and to pick up the high schoolers that were working for him. And he didn't, and the only mentions in the press of the time are, there's newspaper clippings where he's advertising to get packers and shippers, or he's advertising his camp, or he's, people are astounded by his team of 6 oxen that are sitting in front of the store that he's gone in to purchase flour from on his way home. But there's no picture. There isn't any hard evidence that he, was pulling a lot of strings, other than that he might have just given folks. An interesting anecdote. So his brother did this family thing, which Dayton did. And Dayton had photos of the family. Here's Nathaniel Edwards, and this would be the grandparents of Forrest. And these are his parents, Dominicus and Lottie. And his brother, Llewellyn, clearly sent in the photograph to Dayton because he signed it. Yours truly, Llewellyn Edwards. And then there's Dayton's and Dayton's family. And there's no pictures of Forrest. And the only reason would be that Forrest didn't want to pay really to have his picture taken and send it off to his family. So while he's mentioned in the genealogy, there's no picture of him. And I haven't been able to find him. I've looked through every newspaper article that
I
mentions it.
suspect he didn't want to pay for it, and nobody else cared.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, he was absolute, from our perspective of trying to learn about him, he's a bit of a question because he hired somebody to do repairs on vehicles. They did work for 4 or 5 different times and finally presented him with a bill. He paid the guy and never used it again because he asked to be paid. And yet, there was a woman in the town who he looked up to, and when she became ill in her older age, doing a check on her, found out that she was ill. He hired a doctor to come see her. The doctor said she needs permanent care. He moved her into his house because he had a bathroom and he had oil heat. He hired a full-time nurse to come in and be with her until she passed away. So how do you put those two things together?
What's interesting to me, so he had, some of the anecdotes here, that lady, he had mentioned,
Andy.
yeah, the auntie, that I think she was actually his relative. And she ended up, I can't remember her last name, but she was originally an Allen. And I call her auntie, took care of this lady that needed help. She took care of her in the final years of her life. When she died, she left her her land, which was a half mile of shoreline on Thompson Lake. But I wasn't able to find a direct genealogical connection, but I believe that she was related to him. He took care of her maiden name was Allen. He referred to her as auntie, and then Milton Allen he referred to as his cousin, and Milton Allen is the one that gave him that came up from Calais to take over the orchard after he passed. I was saying that an interesting tidbit that came from here is, Forrest had 1,500 acres of land, which is amazing to think about right now. But when he died, nobody wanted it.
No.
He
Shoreland too.
But what were they going to do with it? Milton Allen, here he's like, am I going to do with it? And he got an extra $50,000 to take care of the orchard and keep it going. The only stipulation being that on the homestead property, nobody could cut down a forest that he had left behind him. Trees, though I think that those ended up being cleared by Mr. Media at some point. But Milton ended up being given essentially the rest of the family, Forrest's brother, his nieces, they didn't want anything to do with this property. They didn't want to pay the maintenance. They gave Milton their shares, their rights to the homestead for $1 each, just to be able to get the deed right in 1964. And Milton ended up selling it. He first advertised it for sale in 61, but the deeds didn't process to him until 64. So I don't know when he sold it after that. When did you all buy property?
We bought it in the early 80s. He sold it to a development company that was created to buy it. It's called Tobacco Inc.
Yeah.
And they pretty much went in and took the best out of the property. They did the subdivision, Tobacco. They took 4 million feet of pine and oak off the property.
Yeah, which would violate the last. Right, I think that would violate. So Forrest's only thing was on the homestead property not to clear the trees.
But they're the ones that took it from Milton.
And over the years, it's been built up. The house that I lived in Otisfield when I was here is but some of his legacy still goes on. Did anybody else here happen to know Forrest or have any stories about Forrest?
I did. I remember Forrest, when I was a little girl, he used to come down to the Otisfield General Store and park and whatever. You remember, didn't he have a red truck? Drive a red truck?
We had a different truck every year.
Oh, well, my dad told us, there were the three of us in my family, and my dad told us, he said, you look out, if you see Forrest Edwards coming in his red truck, you get out of the way. He always drives right down the middle of the road. And you better get over because he won't. And that was a tale around town. I don't know if it's true or not, but that's what I was told. So maybe you can decide what he would.
Well, based on his story, it sounds accurate to me.
Yeah, after a year, he needed a new truck. The truck lasted 1 year. Nothing but junk by the time you get done with it after 1 year. You go down and buy a brand new one.
Oh, dear.
Yeah, there was, here's the, so I do have a picture here. You can all come look at these documents and things after we're done. The apple storage barn, I think it was built by Dominicus originally. The 140-foot barn, enormous. Burned down, I believe.
And the seven fell down.
Fell down? Fell down.
His farmhouse burned down? His farmhouse burned down?
Yeah,
Firehouse burned down.
yes, the original place.
It's the story of houses, old houses in Otisfield, I think.
That happened in
My
Storm
husband and I bought-
1974.
74.
Big storm, 4th of July storm. I always thought it was struck by lightning, but then I read in one of the Otisfield books, or the Thompson Lane book, that it was the owner heard the storm coming and was doing grilling and dumped the coals, the hot coals out and went into his house, and the coals ended up catching fire.
Well, they put the grills in the barn, and the barn acted like both ends were open, and it pulled it down on it, and that's what started the fire.
Oh, wow.
My father, my brother, and Fred Peterson, they all went running up because they knew there was a fire. Fred Peterson was the meter shorts in his oar to pound out the fire. But no fire equipment could get in because the trees were down everywhere. There was no passable road.
That particular storm was probably the closest thing to a tornado this area had for quite a while.
Right.
It started in Bridgeton and hopped its way down through Otisfield, and it happened to come down on the Forrest Edwards Road area. And so there were literally something like 100 trees across the road between Forrest Edwards' house and Powhatan Road. And so the fire department couldn't get there.
Easy.
What year?
74, 4th of July.
But I don't know. So I don't really have anything else to talk about for us. I just like to imagine a large man with torn trousers and a rope belt who the town borrowed money from and who, state politicians that are favors to that just sold apples from his property at least to the bucks. But he, as far as I can tell, he seems like a genuinely involved person. Short of the only things I can see where he really shunned other people were when he paid off his fiancées to leave him.
You're talking about the cemetery that you built, that's where you buried everything. Well, East Gilson's wife was in charge of it. And we worked out a deal where half of it was still wooded.
Yeah.
So she paid me what she had for the money that left over to do it. And I sold 2 truckloads of logs off in that piece. And I cleared the rest of the cemetery where they're buried now.
Yeah.
Down there.
Oh wow. So you worked on the cemetery too? So you helped build out the cemetery as well?
I didn't do it.
Oh,
He said, did you help work on making the cemetery too?
No, I just cleared it so they could expand
yeah.
on that end of it.
So did you do any work for him on crops other than apples?
Well, I helped, cut some wood
Yeah.
and haul off the brush.
Because my understanding was he raised potatoes and he raised some hops because one year the hop market wasn't very good. So he filled his house with hops and the next spring he sold them all as raisins.
Oh, really?
And made money.
No, I didn't get any.
You didn't get any of that,
Yeah.
But they probably learned that from Dominicus here. When Dominicus had a hops crop, it didn't sell, this article here, it didn't sell very well.
Yeah.
And so he just saved it over the year, and then he sold it the next year and made $1,500 profit.
Speaking of the cemetery, I wonder, my mother's family grew up in Otisfield, and my uncle, he was born in around 1924, and he worshiped big personalities and characters, and I remember he told so many Forrest Edwards stories. I don't remember a single one. I wish I could, but is it true that for the South Otisfield Cemetery, he set up a trust fund or a bank account for its maintenance, and that was the money until the town took it over, a few years ago? It was a private cemetery, I think, for a long, long time.
I didn't find any information about that, but
Yeah.
it does sound like something that he would have done.
Yeah, that was always my understanding, but.
No, I was surprised at how short his will was, and also at how low the property value of his property was. When he died at 1,500 acres, the homestead, multiple buildings, houses, all of that was valued at, I think, about $70,000. And and then he had $180,000 in cash and other interests. I found it in your notes, Mr. Merck, that the waterfront property, the cabin is valued at, that area is like $6.5 million now, or was at this point in time.
One house down there 2 years ago sold for $2.5 million. And that was one house with a
Half that.
100 feet of frontage.
Yeah.
You have to remember back then, land was selling for $2 to $4 an acre.
Oh,
In the 50s. In Maine, it didn't have a lot of value.
no, didn't. My grandparents bought their camp down on the coast for $10,000 in 1970. Their house valued at $500,000. All right. Question?
Kilby Edwards.
Kilby Edwards is just another one of the Edwards family members. Not directly related to Forrest. But so there were at least two brothers that came, Nathaniel and Jonathan, were sons of John Edwards. And they had a lot of children. They mostly lived over in East Otisfield and Undertown and through Maberville and Casco. And so entire plots of land were owned by different members of the Edwards families, which led to the anecdote that I was looking for, where that Forrest Edwards built. The reason the road goes as it does with a big turnaround around is because he had to build the road around, or the road had to be built around his family's property, his cousin's property, because he and his cousins didn't get along and they wouldn't let him travel over it.
It was a while ago that I walked the Forrest Edwards Road, and I remember being impressed with the stonework, not the build, well, that was impressive too, but more in the landscaping. Was that his work?
Yeah, most likely. He did a lot of stonework. Just it was or if he did it because it would last and he didn't want to spend money on repairs, you know.
He was creative. I mean, it's beautiful.
Well, yeah, and his brother, Llewellyn, went on to be, he's a structural engineer. He was responsible for building large bridges, responsible for the war effort. I think Llewellyn actually, if you go up to UMaine, there's some areas where there's like a tank on display and some World War I ordnance. And Llewellyn actually bought that and gave it to the university so that they could put it on display because he thought that it would be interesting for the students.
Who built the house? Because I remember it as a kid. And it had like these huge pillars coming down all through the front. Who was responsible for the building of that? They look Greek, almost.
Hard to say which building was built. Dominicus Edwards built on the homestead the original buildings that were there. Forrest expanded and built some of his own. So it would either be Forrest or his father, most likely.
It was just so different than the rest of the buildings there.
Did he start his forest up his orchards from seedlings or trees that were already there, or?
He would have most likely imported rootstock and trees. So Red Delicious, Golden Delicious are both created by, I think, the Stark Brothers orchards out of state. Mm-hmm. And so he would have received rootstock and grafted trees, most likely, to build out, to start the orchard.
And how long would it take for them to become profit or
I can tell you from my experience with my apples, it takes
Probably in production, you need them to be 5 to 8 years old. Mm-hmm. And they're putting out like a bushel at that point. Later on, they put out 15 or maybe even as much as 30. It depended on whether they were semi-dwarf or standard size. He did a lot of grafting. A lot of his original fruit was on a variety called Ben
Davis.
Ben Davis. But it didn't taste very good, but they stored well and they shipped well. And when the change came to things like Red Delicious and all, he used the roots that were there, put the new varieties on them by grafting, and saved some time and got some pretty good production.
Yeah, and by the time he took over the orchard, there were already over 200 trees that his father planted. They would have been 25 years old by that point.
Where we live was like a 15-acre field. When we bought that, there were 500 and some Golden Delicious and early Macs on that hill. Since then, I've cut almost all of them down, or they've fallen down. But some of those trees must be 100 years old.
Yeah.
He had some awful big trees, awful tall trees. I know when you was picking, that boy told him you had a pretty long ladder to get top of the tree.
Yeah. Other questions?
I'm just curious if you had any information on the cabins that he rented on the lake.
Just that he bought them and that he rented them out. And that eventually they were sold. There aren't any real historical, or there aren't any mentions of them in the newspapers or the like. The only thing that we have is that the advertisement that he got.
So what year is that?
1935. This is June 23rd, 1935. He's advertising it now. But he seemed to diversify his business, and if he could make money, he would.
The Forrest Edwards Road, did he name it after himself, or did the town name it after he passed away?
That I do not know. I think that it was called the Forrest Edwards Road by the town before he passed away. I have records where people were referring to it as the Forrest Edwards Road while he was alive, but I don't know if he named it or if that's just what people called it because he lived down there. We didn't have a formal naming process for roads way back in the day. Things were named after whatever was up there. I grew up on the Dorr Road, and it wasn't because my family named it. It was because they had a homestead there. Any other questions?
Did he have any hobbies? Did he have any religious affiliation? Did he,
So he was a Freemason, and the only, back then there were a few more requirements, but the only requirement to be a Freemason is that you believe in a higher power. So he definitely had some religious inkling. But near as I can tell, aside from stonework, actually didn't really have hobbies that didn't involve making money. He spent most of his time working the orchards and hauling his apples back and forth.
and no travels to other during the off season, or just he's a homebody?
It seems to be. His brothers. There's records of his brothers traveling to Europe. His brother Llewellyn, his brother Dayton, had one son, and his son got sick when they were traveling in Europe and died when he returned as a teenager. But there's no records of Forrest ever doing anything other than hauling his apples, because so they go harvest all these apples during the season, and then they store them in a large cold storage barn, and so then he would haul them off for delivery all winter long. He rode his oxen right across Thompson Lake, and so he could cut miles off his tour, off his travels over to the Canyon Falls. I don't think he did anything. I don't know if he did anything fun. I don't have any records.
During the Great Depression, was he impacted by that, or was he a little too young for that?
No, he seemed to do actually quite well during the Great Depression. It's when he's advertising these Lake Thompson camps, and he seemed to be a good force for the community as a whole. People that needed money at that time, he loaned it out. So if you were to go look at the Cumberland County deeds, you'll see in the 1930s just a whole host of mortgages of people borrowing money from Forrest and then either paying it back later or him forgiving that debt. Like I said, I never saw, I didn't find any foreclosures. I didn't find any time he actually took someone's property, but he always made them put up collateral for it. In fact, there was one, I printed out here, where there was only one where he did anything besides forgive the debt, and it was someone who borrowed in 1934 $1,300 from him, and in 1938 he sold that mortgage to that person's children for $1, so essentially forgiving it.
Any evidence of political affiliation?
No, no. Besides, I have to go look at the political affiliations of the senators that got him, or the legislators that got him money, and see if maybe he did. But he was a member of, the only things that I saw that he did outside of being at home were the Freemasons and the Grange, where he played music. Any other questions or stories? Because I'm just regurgitating things I read about stories.
What was the last year that the apple orchard was the working apple orchard?
What's the question?
What's the last year that the orchard was an orchard?
I would guess late 70s, but I don't remember for sure.
Well, he died
54.
in 54. Silvaqua, one of the interesting things about Silvaqua was it was made up of 5 people. One was a logger, one was a forester and banker for Casco Bank, one was a real estate agent, and one was a person who ran orchards. So all the resources that were involved in Forrest Edwards estates were represented by professionals in those 4 owners. So John Geiger was the owner who ran the orchards, and he ran them after they bought it from Mill Valley, because he was converting his orchard in Bridgeton over to semi-dwarf trees. His son now runs an orchard called 5 Fields, and that was John Geiger's. We bought the property in the early 80s, and in between that, it was left idle for a number of years, and then a guy named Caligari, I believe it was John Caligari, ran it for 3 years, didn't make any money because the trees weren't producing anymore. Then he stopped for 3 years, and then we ran it for 2 years, and we didn't make any money. We didn't make our cash back, let alone our time. And so we just said, you know, we'll do something else with this, which has been fine. So I would say the last times it was really operated commercially, probably in the late 60s, where it was really, where all of it was run at the same time.
I remember them caring for the apple trees in the 70s. I got paid for picking apples off the ground, like a nickel a bushel. We had to pick them off the ground because they were using those for cider. And that was probably 74, 75.
So would you been working with John Carter?
I don't know, it was just a bunch of us kids. They said, hey, we'll give you some money if you pick up some apples off the ground.
So it's probably
One of our friends would climb the tree and shake the tree and we'd pick all the apples off the ground.
You didn't worry about having a W-2 and all that?
So that was probably towards the end of its commercial life, right around that time.
Yeah, that I'm guessing was maybe around 75, 76.
Interesting.
Well, there are refreshments. There are lots of documents.
There are refreshments.
Yes, there are refreshments.
Yes.
And I'll be around for a bit longer if you have any more questions that I can answer. Otherwise, you should talk to the two experts.